The Great Escape. The real story of the tunnel beneath Stalag Luft III, A History for Sleep. The film gave you a heroic adventure, a motorcycle, a whistle tune everyone can still hum, a man in a leather jacket leaping a barbed wire fence into freedom, or at least into a dramatic, doomed attempt at it. The real story does not have a motorcycle in it. There was no American officer on a Triumph outrunning German patrols across the Bavarian countryside. That scene was invented for the screen, a piece of cinematic license layered onto events that did not need embellishment to be extraordinary. The real story is 600 men digging 3 tunnels for the better part of a year. It is 76 men slipping into the cold dark of a March night in 1944. And it is 50 of those men being murdered afterward, not in battle, not by accident, but by deliberate order, each one driven to a quiet spot by the side of a road and shot, on instructions that came from the very top of the German state. This is the story without the soundtrack. Get comfortable. It deserves to be told slowly, and it deserves to be told completely, including the part the film could not bring itself to show in full. Stalag Luft III sat in a pine forest near the town of Sagan, in the German region of Lower Silesia, territory that today belongs to Poland and goes by the name Jagan. The camp had been built specifically to hold Allied Air Force officers, and it had been built with a particular problem in mind. These were not ordinary prisoners. Air Force officers tended to be resourceful, technically educated, persistent, and absolutely committed to the idea that their job, once captured, was to keep trying to get back into the war. The Luftwaffe, which administered the camp rather than the army or the SS, understood this mentality better than most captors might have, because many of the German guards were airmen themselves, with a certain professional respect for their captives that coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with their duty to keep them locked up. The site itself had been chosen with escape prevention specifically in mind. The camp sat on sandy, loose soil, the kind of ground that collapses easily when disturbed, making tunneling extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The barracks were built on low stilts, raised perhaps 2 feet off the ground, specifically so that guards patrolling the camp could see underneath them and spot any sign of tunneling activity at a glance. Seismographic microphones were buried in the ground around the perimeter, designed to detect the vibrations of digging at a distance. The forest had been cleared back from the wire to create a wide, open security zone with no cover. Guard towers stood at intervals along the fence, manned around the clock, with searchlights that swept the open ground at night. By the engineering standards of 1942 and 1943, Stalag Luft III was about as close to escape-proof as a prisoner of war camp could be made. The men inside it disagreed. Squadron leader Roger Bushell, a South African-born British officer who had been a barrister before the war and a fighter pilot during it, had already attempted to escape from German captivity twice before arriving at Sagan and had been recaptured both times. He arrived at Stalag Luft III with a reputation for persistence that bordered on the obsessive, and with an idea that was, by the standards of escape attempts to that point in the war, almost absurdly ambitious. Not 1 tunnel, 3, simultaneously. The logic was straightforward once you understood the problem. Previous escape attempts at various camps had typically involved a single tunnel, dug by a small group, kept as secret as possible even from other prisoners, with the obvious vulnerability that if the Germans found it, through a lucky discovery, an informant, a routine search that happened to hit the right spot, The entire effort was lost in a single stroke. Bushel's insight was that if you built 3 tunnels at once, starting from different points in the camp, the loss of any one of them did not mean the loss of the entire operation. The Germans could find one tunnel and congratulate themselves on having stopped the escape, while 2 others continued, undiscovered, toward the wire. The 3 tunnels were given names, deliberately mundane, chosen so that a careless mention of one in conversation would not immediately signal to anyone listening that an escape was underway. Tom, Dick, Harry. Tom began in a darkened corner of one hut, its trapdoor disguised beneath a stove that could be moved aside and replaced to conceal the opening. Dick's entrance was hidden in a drain sump in a washroom, accessed by lifting a section of the floor that had been carefully cut and refitted to leave no visible seam. Harry's entrance was concealed beneath a stove in a different hut, entirely similarly disguised. The organizational structure that Bushell built to support this effort was, in its own way, as remarkable as the tunnels themselves. He created what amounted to a clandestine engineering and logistics operation employing, at its peak, several hundred of the roughly 2,000 prisoners held at the camp's north compound. There were tunnel diggers working in shifts in the cramped, sand-choked dark. There were engineers responsible for shoring up the tunnel walls against collapse. There were carpenters who fabricated the wooden supports. There were tailors who converted military uniforms into civilian-looking clothing for the eventual escapees. There were forgers who produced fake identity papers, travel permits, and other documents good enough to pass inspection by German authorities. There were men responsible for compiling maps and gathering intelligence about train schedules and border crossings. There were lookouts, known within the organization by the codename Stooges, whose job was to watch for German guards and signal warnings to the working parties without appearing to be doing anything other than standing around in the yard. And then there was the sand problem, which in some ways was the most difficult challenge of the entire operation. Digging 3 tunnels 9 meters underground, deep enough to avoid detection by the perimeter microphones, through sandy soil that constantly threatened to collapse, generated an enormous quantity of excavated sand. The sand beneath Stalag Luft III was a distinctive, bright yellow, sharply different in color from the gray-brown topsoil that covered the surface of the camp. If a guard saw fresh yellow sand anywhere in the compound, it would immediately raise the alarm that tunneling was underway somewhere nearby. The solution that the prisoners devised has become one of the most celebrated pieces of improvised engineering in the history of prisoner-of-war escapes. Men called penguins, for the way they waddled when fully loaded, wore long bags sewn into the lining of their trousers, filled with sand from the tunnel workings. They would walk around the compound in the ordinary course of exercise and conversation, and through a drawstring mechanism, they could release small amounts of sand from the bags, which would trickle down the trouser legs and disperse across the ground as they walked, where it would blend with the existing soil and become invisible. Hundreds of men performed this task, thousands of times over the course of many months, moving an estimated total of more than 100 tons of excavated sand out of the tunnel system and into harmless dispersal across the campgrounds and gardens. The tunnels themselves required engineering solutions to problems that would have stopped less determined men entirely. The sandy soil meant that unsupported tunnel walls collapsed almost immediately. The solution was to line every section of every tunnel with wooden boards, salvaged primarily from the bedboards of the prisoners' own bunks. Over the course of the construction, the prisoners dismantled so many bedboards from so many bunks that German guards conducting inspections noticed beds in some huts had been reduced to a handful of supporting slats, the prisoners sleeping on what amounted to a skeleton frame, and had to be told, not entirely truthfully, that the missing boards had been used for general camp maintenance and repairs. Deep tunnels without ventilation are a serious hazard. A man working at the sand face 9 meters underground, in a passage barely large enough to crawl through, can suffocate from lack of oxygen or be overcome by the heat and exhaustion of working in an unventilated space. The prisoners built a ventilation system using tin cans, hundreds of them salvaged from the food parcels sent by the Red Cross and from the prisoners' own rations, fashioned into a kind of bellows system connected by ductwork running the length of each tunnel, allowing fresh air to be pumped down to the working face. Lighting in a tunnel running 9 meters underground and extending, in the case of Harry, more than 100 meters in length, required an electrical system. The prisoners tapped illegally into the camp's own electrical supply, running concealed wiring down into the tunnels and rigging improvised lamps, again often fashioned from tin cans, using fat skimmed from the food rations as fuel when the electrical supply was unreliable or unavailable. Moving sand and moving men through a tunnel this long required transport. The prisoners built small wheeled trolleys running on tracks made from wooden slats, allowing diggers to push carts of excavated sand back toward the entrance shaft, and, eventually, allowing escapees to be hauled along the length of the tunnel rather than having to crawl the entire distance themselves. The scale of material resources that this required, all of it improvised or stolen from camp supplies, all of it concealed from German guards who conducted regular searches of the huts, is staggering to consider. Historians studying the operation afterward estimated that the construction of the 3 tunnels consumed roughly 4,000 bedboards, several hundred yards of electrical wire, hundreds of tin cans, dozens of stolen tools, and an enormous quantity of cloth, paper, and ink diverted toward the forgery operation that produced the travel documents the escapees would eventually carry. All of this had to be done while maintaining the ordinary rhythms of camp life closely enough that German guards, who were not stupid and who conducted regular and sometimes thorough searches, did not discover the scale of what was happening beneath their feet. They came close more than once. In the autumn of 1943, German guards discovered the tunnel codenamed Tom. The precise circumstances of the discovery are disputed in different accounts. Some sources suggest a guard's dog reacted to a disturbed patch of ground. Others suggest a routine search simply got lucky. Others suggest mounting suspicion from the unusual quietness or behavior of certain prisoners led the guards to search more carefully in a particular hut. Whatever the precise trigger, the discovery was a serious blow. Tom had been the most advanced of the 3 tunnels at certain points in the project, and its loss represented months of labor and a substantial fraction of the organization's accumulated resources suddenly gone. The Germans, having found one tunnel, conducted the search with the particular satisfaction of men who believed they had solved the problem. They did not find Dick or Harry. The remaining 2 tunnels continued, now under even greater secrecy, with the organization's leadership making a calculated decision about how to proceed. Dick was eventually repurposed rather than abandoned entirely. Rather than continuing to dig toward the wire, the prisoners decided to use the partially completed tunnel as a storage facility, a hidden space, already excavated and already concealed, where they could stockpile the materials that the operation's forgers, tailors, and engineers were producing in increasing quantities. Maps, fake identity documents, civilian-style clothing, converted from military uniforms, compasses, food supplies intended to sustain escapees during their journey after emerging from the tunnel. All of this needed somewhere to be hidden, where German searchers were unlikely to find it, and the disused tunnel served that purpose effectively for the remainder of the project. The entire focus of the operation now shifted to Harry. Harry's construction continued through the winter of 1943 into 1944. The diggers working in shifts in conditions that combined physical danger with simple, miserable discomfort. The cold of a German winter, the cramped confines of a tunnel barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, the constant low-level fear of collapse or discovery, the sheer monotony of months of labor toward a goal that remained, for a long time, entirely theoretical. By the early months of 1944, the tunnel was approaching completion. The engineers responsible for surveying its progress calculated the distance it needed to travel to reach beyond the perimeter fence and into the cover of the surrounding forest, where escapees emerging from the exit shaft would have some concealment from the searchlights and guard towers before making their way to whatever transport or route out of the area they had planned. The calculation, it turned out, was wrong, not by a catastrophic margin, but by enough to matter a great deal on the night it counted. The tunnel's planners had underestimated the distance to the tree line, or had made an error in their underground surveying that was difficult to correct without being able to check their work against visible landmarks from below ground. When the tunnel finally reached what its diggers believed was a safe distance beyond the wire, the exit shaft that they dug upward toward the surface broke through into open ground, not into the forest cover they had planned for, but into a clear strip of land still within sight of a guard tower, several meters short of the tree line that was supposed to provide concealment for escaping men. This was discovered with considerable alarm only on the night of the escape itself, when it was far too late to do anything about it except adapt the plan as best the organizers could. The night chosen for the escape was March 24th, 1944. A clear, cold night with a full moon, which in almost every respect was about the worst possible weather for an attempt that depended on darkness and concealment. The moonlight would make movement across open ground far more visible to anyone watching from the guard towers than a cloudy or moonless night would have allowed. But the organizers had run out of time to wait for better conditions. The window for escape was closing, partly due to seasonal considerations about how long darkness would last as spring approached, partly due to plans within the camp to relocate certain key prisoners that would have disrupted the operation, and partly due to the simple, accumulated risk of discovery the longer they waited. They decided to proceed. The plan called for as many as 200 men to pass through the tunnel and escape into the night, dispersing in small groups or individually toward planned routes across Germany and occupied Europe, aiming for neutral countries or allied lines depending on each man's specific plan, equipment, and language skills. The reality of the tunnel's actual operating speed undermined this ambition almost immediately. The passage through Harry was slower and more difficult than anticipated. The trolley system jammed repeatedly. Sand continued to fall from sections of the tunnel wall, despite the wooden supports, requiring repairs and clearance that consumed precious time. Each man had to traverse the tunnel's full length individually in sequence, and the bottleneck this created meant that the rate of escape was far slower than the planners had hoped. By the time dawn was approaching and the operation had to be called off for fear of discovery in full daylight, only 76 men had made it through the tunnel and out into the night. well under half of the original ambition, but still, by any historical standard, an extraordinary number of prisoners to have escaped from a single facility in a single operation. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, a German guard patrolling near the perimeter spotted a man emerging from the tunnel's exit shaft in the open ground beyond the wire, the very gap between the tunnel's actual exit point and the tree line that the planners had hoped would provide cover. The alarm was raised immediately. The camp came awake to sirens, searchlights, and the sudden, urgent mobilization of the entire German Guard establishment. The hunt began within minutes and would not properly end for weeks. What followed was one of the largest manhunts conducted on German soil during the war. The news that 76 Allied officers had escaped from a supposedly secure prison camp reached the highest levels of the German state within hours, and the reaction at those highest levels set in motion events that would transform what might otherwise have been remembered as a remarkable but ultimately containable escape attempt into one of the genuine atrocities of the war's treatment of prisoners. Adolf Hitler received the report of the escape personally, and by all accounts his reaction was one of furious, disproportionate rage. 76 trained Allied Air Force officers loose somewhere in the German rear areas, potentially making their way toward neutral borders or attempting sabotage or intelligence. Gathering along the way, represented in Hitler's mind not merely a security failure, but a serious affront to German prestige and authority at a moment when the war was already going badly on multiple fronts. His order, communicated through Heinrich Himmler and the SS apparatus that increasingly arrogated to itself authority over matters that should, under the laws of war that Germany had formally signed and was nominally bound by, have remained within the jurisdiction of the Luftwaffe and the ordinary prisoner of war system. The escaped officers, once recaptured, were not to be returned to the camp as prisoners of war. They were to be shot. This was, in the most direct and unambiguous sense, a war crime. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which Germany had signed and which governed the treatment of prisoners of war on all sides during the conflict, explicitly prohibited the execution of prisoners for the act of attempting to escape. Escape attempts were recognized under international law as a normal and expected behavior of captured combatants, subject at most to disciplinary punishment such as solitary confinement, never to execution. Senior Luftwaffe officers, including the commandant of Stalag Luft III himself, understood this immediately and raised objections. Several generals pointed out to Himmler and to Hitler's immediate circle that the order as given constituted a clear violation of international law, that German prisoners of war held by the Allies might face retaliatory treatment if such an action became known, and that the Luftwaffe's own officer corps would regard the murder of fellow airmen, even enemy airmen, as a violation of the professional and human norms that had, to some degree, persisted even in the brutal context of the broader war. These objections produced a partial modification rather than a reversal of the order. Hitler, after consultation with Himmler and others, agreed that not every single one of the 76 escapees needed to be executed, a concession that reflected practical and propaganda concerns more than any genuine moral reconsideration. But he insisted that a substantial majority be killed, and that the killings be carried out by the Gestapo rather than through any process resembling a military or legal proceeding. The Gestapo was given the assignment of hunting down the 76 men across the breadth of German-controlled territory, and the killings were to be carried out quietly away from the camp itself, presented afterward through falsified reports, rather than acknowledged as the deliberate executions they actually were. The manhunt itself unfolded across an extraordinary geographic range. The 76 escapees had dispersed according to their individual plans, some attempting to travel by train using forged documents and civilian disguises, posing as French or Dutch laborers or businessmen traveling on legitimate papers, others moving on foot through forests and across open country, aiming for specific border crossings into neutral Switzerland or Sweden, or hoping to reach occupied territories where resistance networks might be able to help them toward eventual evacuation. Most were captured within days. The German security apparatus, alerted to the scale of the escape and operating under direct pressure from the highest levels of the state, conducted checks at train stations, roadblocks on major routes, and searches of hotels and boarding houses across a wide swath of Germany, Czechoslovakia, and parts of occupied France and the Low Countries. Men with forged papers that did not quite withstand scrutiny, men whose accents or mannerisms betrayed them despite their disguises, men who simply ran out of food or money or luck before they could cross a border. One by one, the captured escapees were taken into custody. Of the 76 men who escaped, only 3 ultimately reached genuine freedom. 2 Norwegian officers serving with the RAF, and 1 Dutch officer, each following separate and individually arranged routes that took advantage of contacts, language skills, or geography that the majority of the escapees, predominantly British and Commonwealth officers, without the same network of local assistance, did not have access to. These 3 men made their way, through different paths, to neutral territory and from there back to Allied lines, becoming the only complete successes of the entire operation in the narrowest sense of actually achieving what an escape is meant to achieve. The remaining 73 were captured. Of those 73, 50 were murdered. The killings were carried out over a period of roughly 3 weeks following the escape, in small groups at various locations across Germany and occupied territory. The men were typically told after the capture that they were being transported back to a prison camp or to Gestapo headquarters for processing. They were driven by vehicle to remote locations, fields, forest clearings, the sides of a country roads, and shot, usually from behind, usually without warning, by Gestapo officers acting under direct orders. The official cover story, distributed afterward through German military channels, to explain the deaths to anyone who might ask, including eventually to the International Red Cross, and through diplomatic channels to the British government, was that the men had been shot while attempting to escape again during transport, or while resisting capture. This was, in every documented case investigated after the war, a fabrication. The men had been murdered in cold blood, unarmed, under guard, with no genuine attempt at escape or resistance occurring at the moment of their deaths. Among the 50 murdered men was Roger Bushell himself, the South African barrister and fighter pilot whose vision and organizational drive had made the entire operation possible. He was captured along with another escapee near the French border and shot by Gestapo officers on March 29, 1944. 5 days after the escape itself, his body later recovered and identified along with the others in the post-war investigation that would eventually piece together exactly what had happened to each of the 50 men. The British government, informed of the killings through diplomatic channels and through the gradual accumulation of intelligence over the following months, recognized immediately the scale of what had occurred. Not merely an unfortunate wartime tragedy, but a coordinated war crime carried out under direct orders from the highest levels of the German state, in flagrant violation of the laws of war that govern the treatment of captured combatants on both sides. A formal protest was lodged. The British government made clear through diplomatic and propaganda channels that the killings would not be forgotten and that those responsible would eventually be held to account. This was not an empty threat, though it would take years after the war's end for the promise to be substantially fulfilled. The investigation that the British military launched after Germany's defeat in 1945 was a methodical, painstaking piece of detective work conducted under the authority of the Royal Air Force's Special Investigation Branch, tasked specifically with identifying every individual responsible for ordering or carrying out the 50 murders and bringing as many of them as possible to justice. The investigators worked from captured German documents, from the testimony of surviving prisoners and camp staff, from interviews with German civilians who had witnessed elements of the killings or the subsequent disposal of remains, and from the painstaking cross-referencing of dates, locations, and unit assignments that allowed them to reconstruct, case by case, exactly which Gestapo officers had been present at which killing, and in many cases who had personally fired the fatal shots. This investigation took years. It extended into the early 1950s, well after most other wartime investigations and trials had concluded, reflecting both the complexity of the case. 50 separate killings spread across a wide geographic area, carried out by overlapping but not identical groups of perpetrators, and the British government's determination to see the matter through to a thorough conclusion rather than allowing it to be absorbed into the broader and faster moving process of post-war denazification and reconciliation that was, by the early 1950s, already beginning to prioritize rebuilding a stable West Germany as a Cold War ally over continuing to pursue every wartime crime to its fullest possible accounting. The investigators identified a substantial number of the individuals responsible. Trials were conducted primarily before British military courts operating in occupied Germany, though the process also intersected with broader German post-war legal proceedings as the new West German judicial system began to take shape. Some of the identified perpetrators were tried and sentenced to death and executed. Others received long prison sentences. A number were never located or never definitively identified, having died in the war's final chaotic months, having successfully concealed their identities and disappeared into post-war German civilian life, or having escaped to other countries beyond the reach of British or German prosecution. The accounting was imperfect, as post-war accountings for the crimes of the Nazi state almost always were. But it was real, and it represented one of the more thorough and sustained efforts by any Allied power to specifically pursue justice for a discrete, well-documented war crime against military prisoners, rather than allowing such cases to be absorbed into the larger and necessarily less detailed reckoning that dealt with the Holocaust and other crimes of even vaster scale. Of the 76 men who escaped on the night of March 24th, 1944, 23 survived the ordeal. Most of these were among the men recaptured who were not selected for execution, a decision that appears to have been driven partly by practical limits on how many killings the German authorities were willing to carry out without risking even greater international exposure and condemnation, and partly by simple inconsistency and the chaos of an operation being carried out hastily, under political pressure, across a wide geographic area by different local Gestapo units, with varying degrees of zeal for the assignment. These 23 survivors were returned to prisoner of war camps, some back to Stalag Luft III itself, others to different facilities, where they would remain in captivity for the remainder of the war, carrying with them the knowledge of what had happened to the friends and fellow officers who had crawled through the tunnel beside them and had not been so fortunate in where the dice of capture and selection happened to fall. The story of the Great Escape, as it came to be known, entered public consciousness gradually after the war, through memoirs written by survivors, through the British military's own after-action reporting, and eventually in 1963, through a major Hollywood film that took the broad outline of the true events and reshaped them into a more conventional adventure narrative. Compressing timelines, inventing composite characters, adding the now famous motorcycle chase that never happened in reality, and perhaps most significantly, for the way the story has been remembered by general audiences ever since, treating the fate of the 50 murdered escapees with considerably less weight and detail than the real events deserved. The film was not dishonest about the fact that escapees were killed. It does show executions, and it does not pretend the operation ended in simple triumph. But the dramatic structure of a commercial adventure film, built around appealing characters and an exciting narrative arc, inevitably softened and compressed what was, in historical reality, a sustained, methodical, weeks-long campaign of murder carried out by a state security apparatus against unarmed prisoners of war. What the film could not easily convey, and what the true history makes unavoidable, is the specific moral weight of what happened to those 50 men. Not death in the heat of combat, not death from disease or starvation in brutal but impersonal camp conditions, but each man being told a lie about his fate, driven to an isolated location, and shot by officers of a state security service acting on direct orders from the head of that state. A decision made not in the confusion of battle, but in calculated, considered fashion, weighed and modified through bureaucratic consultation about how many of the 76 could be killed without provoking consequences the German leadership judged unacceptable. This calculation, the explicit weighing of how many murders were politically survivable, is in some ways the most chilling single detail of the entire story. It reveals a system in which the deaths of 50 specific, named known individuals were treated as a matter of acceptable political cost-benefit analysis at the highest levels of a government, carried out with the bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized so much of the broader machinery of Nazi violence, even as the same system formally remained a signatory to international agreements explicitly prohibiting exactly what it was doing. The tunnel itself, Harry, the survivor of the three, the one that actually carried 76 men beneath the wire and into the cold March night, exists today as an archaeological site. Segen, now Żagań, lies within Poland, and the location of the former camp has been the subject of historical and archaeological investigation in the decades since the war, with researchers locating and, in some cases, partially excavating sections of the original tunnel system, confirming through physical evidence many of the details that survivor testimony had described: the wooden shoring, the ventilation ductwork, sections of the rail system used to move carts of sand, and, eventually, escaping men along the tunnel's length. The site today includes a museum dedicated to preserving the history of the camp and the escape, situated in the area that was once the North Compound, where the operation was planned and executed. Visitors can see preserved sections of tunnel, displays of the improvised tools and equipment that the prisoners fabricated, and a memorial specifically commemorating the 50 officers who were murdered following the capture. The memorial lists their names their ranks, their nationalities. A reminder that the men who died represented not a single nation's loss, but a coalition's. British officers alongside Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Poles, Norwegians, and others who had volunteered to fly and fight against Germany from across the breadth of the Allied world, and who, having survived the considerable danger of aerial combat long enough to be shot down and captured rather than killed outright, found that survival itself, achieved through extraordinary collective ingenuity and sustained effort over many months of clandestine labor, was not enough to save them from a different and more deliberate form of violence once they reached the surface and the open night air beyond the wire. The story of the Great Escape is, in the end, two stories rather than one, and both deserve to be remembered with equal weight. The first is a story of human ingenuity and cooperative effort under conditions of extreme constraint. Hundreds of men, with almost no resources beyond what they could scavenge, improvise, or steal from their own meager supplies, constructing an engineering project of genuine sophistication. Ventilation systems, electrical lighting, structural supports, a transport system, a forgery operation, an intelligence gathering apparatus, entirely in secret under the eyes of a hostile guard force, sustained over many months by sheer collective will and organizational discipline. The second is a story of what happens when that ingenuity succeeds against an opponent who does not regard the rules of war as binding when those rules become inconvenient. 50 men, having achieved something remarkable, paying for that achievement with their lives, in a process that was not chaotic or accidental but calculated, ordered, and carried out with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized so much of the broader machinery of the regime that killed them. The tunnel is still there, beneath the Polish soil where the camp once stood. The names of the 50 are still listed on the memorial. The 3 men who made it all the way to freedom lived out their lives, mostly quietly, carrying the particular weight of having survived, when so many of their fellow escapees, who had crawled through the same sand and darkness beside them, had not. The pines that once surrounded the camp have grown and changed in the 8 decades since, but pines still stand there, and the ground beneath them still remembers, in the most literal physical sense, the shape of 3 tunnels that several hundred men dug by hand in secret for the chance to walk free. There is a great deal more to understand about the men who built this operation, about the conditions in which they lived, and about how a community of prisoners came to organize itself into something resembling an underground engineering firm with a workforce of several hundred. Stalag Luft III's north compound, where the tunnels were dug, held primarily Royal Air Force officers, along with significant numbers of officers from other Commonwealth Air Forces and a smaller number of American airmen, before the Americans were eventually separated into their own compound elsewhere in the camp complex. The population was almost entirely commissioned officers, a fact that mattered enormously to how the camp operated, because the Geneva Convention afforded officers certain protections and considerable autonomy in managing their own internal affairs that would not necessarily have applied to enlisted prisoners held elsewhere. This autonomy was central to how the escape organization functioned. The senior British officer in the compound exercised a form of authority over the prisoner population that the Germans, bound by the conventions governing officer-prisoners, largely respected, at least in the day-to-day administration of camp life. This gave Bushell and his organization a degree of operational freedom that would have been impossible in a camp holding enlisted men under more direct German control. The organizational structure that managed the escape came to be known informally as the X organization. X standing simply for the unknown, the clandestine, the thing that could not be named openly even among trusted fellow prisoners who were not directly involved. Bushell served as what amounted to the chief executive of this organization, but beneath him sat a structure of departments, each responsible for a specific function, mirroring in miniature the kind of specialized division of labor one might find in a legitimate engineering or intelligence operation. The tunneling teams themselves worked in conditions that are difficult to fully convey through description alone. The tunnels were barely wide enough for a man to crawl through on his stomach, pushing a small cart ahead of him or dragging it behind by a rope. The air at the working face, despite the ventilation system, remained thick and difficult to breathe, heavy with the smell of damp sand and the exertions of the digger. Lighting was dim even when the improvised electrical system functioned correctly, which was not always the case. Power to the system was tapped illegally from the camp's main supply, and any fluctuation or failure in that supply left diggers working in near or total darkness, navigating by touch and memory of the tunnel's exact dimensions. Cave-ins were a constant danger despite the wooden shoring. The sandy soil that made Stalag Luft III's location so attractive to German camp planners as an escape deterrent made every meter of tunnel a genuine risk to the men working inside it. Several near disasters occurred over the many months of construction. Sections of tunnel wall giving way, sand pouring in faster than it could be cleared, diggers having to scramble backward through the cramped passage to avoid being buried. No one died in these collapses during the construction phase, which in retrospect seems almost as remarkable as the engineering achievement itself, given how marginal the safety margins genuinely were. The forgery department, working under conditions of considerable secrecy, even within the broader secrecy of the operation, produced an extraordinary range of false documents. German travel permits, work passes, identity cards, and other official-looking paperwork were hand-drawn and hand-lettered with extraordinary care, using materials smuggled from camp supplies, or in some cases, materials sent in disguised form through Red Cross parcels by associates outside the camp who understood what was needed. The forgers studied genuine German documents obtained through various means, sometimes purchased or traded from corruptible guards, sometimes copied from documents glimpsed during searches or other interactions with camp administration, to understand exactly what authentic papers needed to look like, down to the specific fonts, seals, and bureaucratic language that German officialdom expected to see. The tailoring department converted military uniforms into civilian clothing or into the uniforms of other nations and organizations, work that required considerable skill given the limited materials and tools available. Dye was improvised from various camp materials to alter the distinctive colors of RAF uniforms. Buttons were replaced, insignia removed, cuts altered, all to produce clothing that would not immediately mark its wearer as an escaped Allied officer to any casual observer on a German train platform or city street. A separate intelligence gathering effort compiled what amounted to a substantial library of information relevant to escape planning. Maps of German territory, train timetables obtained through various means, including bribery of more sympathetic or corruptible guards, information about border crossing procedures, details about which areas of occupied or neutral territory might offer the best prospects for assistance from local resistance networks or sympathetic civilians. This intelligence function relied heavily on what the prisoners called contacts, relationships cultivated with certain German guards who could be bribed, coerced, or sometimes simply persuaded through ordinary human relationship building to provide small pieces of useful information, smuggle tools, or other assistance in exchange for cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, or other items from Red Cross parcels that were valuable currency in wartime Germany's increasingly strained economy. Not every guard was a committed National Socialist true believer. Many were older men or those with limited physical fitness for frontline service, assigned to camp duty for various reasons, and some were susceptible to the kind of small scale corruption that prisoners with access to Red Cross luxuries could exploit. The Red Cross parcels themselves deserve specific mention because they were central to the entire operation's logistics in ways that went well beyond their obvious humanitarian purpose of supplementing inadequate camp rations. Beyond the food and basic comfort items they contained, these parcels became a crucial supply chain for materials that could be repurposed for escape preparation. Tin cans for ventilation systems and lamps, cardboard and paper for forgery work, small tools that could be disguised among ordinary contents. Even in some documented cases, items smuggled in deliberately by external contacts working with British intelligence services who understood at some level what the parcels might be used for beyond the stated purpose. The psychological dimension of sustaining several hundred men through many months of clandestine, physically demanding, genuinely dangerous labor that most of them must have understood at some level carried a real risk, not just of failure, but of severe punishment, or worse if discovered, is itself worth considering. Prisoner of war camps, even relatively well administered ones, operating broadly within the bounds of international law, are environments of profound psychological strain. The loss of freedom, the uncertainty about the war's duration and outcome, the separation from family, the monotony of captivity stretching potentially for years with no defined endpoint. The escape organization provided something that went beyond the practical goal of eventually getting men out of the camp. It provided purpose, structure, and a sense of agency in an environment specifically designed to strip prisoners of exactly those things. Men who might otherwise have spent years in increasingly demoralized idleness instead spend the captivity engaged in skilled, purposeful, collaborative work toward a goal that, however uncertain its ultimate success, represented active resistance rather than passive endurance. This is not to romanticize what was, after all, an operation conducted under genuine duress by men who would vastly have preferred not to be prisoners at all. But the historical record, including post war testimony from numerous participants, consistently describes the X organization's work as something that sustained morale and gave structure to camp life in ways that went beyond its specific practical objective. The selection process for who among the several hundred participants in the broader organization would actually be among those who got to use the tunnel on the night of the escape itself was a matter of considerable internal politics and negotiation. Not everyone who contributed labor to digging, forging, tailoring, or gathering intelligence could realistically be accommodated within the tunnel's limited throughput on a single night, and decisions about priority access had to be made. A system was devised that balanced several considerations: men with language skills that gave them realistic prospects of successfully navigating German or occupied territory, undetected, were given priority, on the theory that limited slots should go to those with the best chance of actual success, rather than distributed purely on the basis of contribution to construction. Key organizers and those who had taken on the greatest personal risk in running the operation, Bushel prominent among them, were also prioritized. The remainder of available slots were allocated through a combination of further merit-based selection and, for a portion of the slots, a lottery system intended to give a fair chance to the many ordinary participants who had contributed labor without any special skill that would otherwise have prioritized them. This meant that the 76 men who actually went through the tunnel on the night of March 24th, 1944, were not a random sample of the camp's population, nor were they simply the most senior or most important officers. They were a specifically selected group, chosen through a process that the organization's leadership believed maximized the chances of at least some escapees achieving genuine freedom. A calculation that proved, in the event, tragically optimistic, given that only 3 of the 76 ultimately succeeded. The night of the escape itself deserves a more detailed reconstruction than a simple summary can provide, because the specific sequence of events reveals how close the operation came to both greater success and to even earlier discovery. The evening began with the final preparations, escapees changing into their disguised clothing, collecting their forged papers, and whatever food and equipment they had been allocated, making their way in small groups to the hut containing Harry's entrance without attracting the attention of the relatively small number of guards on duty during the evening hours, when most of the camp's population would ordinarily be confined to their huts, in any case as part of the normal nightly routine. The first men entered the tunnel shortly after the camp's evening routine concluded, and the guards' attention was focused on the more routine business of night patrols rather than any specific suspicion. The early stages of the operation proceeded roughly according to plan, with men moving through the tunnel's length in sequence, each emerging at the far end and making their way, in the cover of darkness, toward whatever route their specific escape plan called for. The problems began to accumulate as the night progressed. The tunnel's transport system, which had functioned adequately during testing, proved less reliable under the sustained pressure of moving dozens of men through in rapid succession. Carts derailed, sand continued to shift and fall from sections of the tunnel wall under the vibration of repeated use, requiring pauses for clearance that ate into the available time. The pace of escape slowed considerably from what had been planned, and as the night wore on, the organizers running the operation from inside the camp had to make increasingly difficult decisions about how many more men could realistically be sent through before the approaching dawn would make continued operation impossible. The discovery of the tunnel by a German guard at approximately 5 in the morning came at almost the worst possible moment for those still waiting their turn inside the camp. Late enough that 76 men had already made it out, but early enough that the operation was clearly far from achieving its original ambition of getting 200 men through before daylight forced an end to the attempt, regardless of discovery. The guard who spotted the escape. Accounts vary on the precise details, but the consensus is that he observed a man emerging from the exit shaft in the open ground beyond the wire, in the gap between the tunnel's actual exit point and the tree line that had been intended to provide cover, raised the alarm immediately, and the camp's German administration responded with the kind of urgent, comprehensive security response that the scale of the breach demanded. Guards rushed to seal the camp's exits. Searchlights swept the surrounding terrain. Telephone calls went out to alert regional security forces, railway police, and eventually, as the scale of the escape became clear, to authorities at the highest levels of the German state, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead, within days, to Hitler's direct order regarding the fate of those recaptured. Inside the camp, the remaining prisoners who had not made it through the tunnel before its discovery faced their own immediate crisis. destroying or concealing evidence of the operation as thoroughly and quickly as possible in the hope of limiting the consequences for those who remained, even as it became rapidly clear that there was no way to fully conceal an operation of this scale once its existence had been definitively revealed by the discovery of an escapee in the act of emerging from the tunnel itself. The scale of the subsequent investigation within the camp and the broader manhunt across German territory reflected the German authorities' recognition that this was not a minor security lapse, but a major embarrassment requiring a major response. Hundreds of additional security personnel were deployed to search the surrounding countryside. Railway stations across a wide region were placed under heightened scrutiny, with passengers subject to identity checks that would not normally have applied. The hunt extended in the days and weeks that followed across hundreds of miles of German and occupied territory as the dispersed escapees, traveling by whatever means their individual plans called for, attempted to reach safety while German security services worked methodically to track them down. The specific circumstances of capture varied considerably from man to man, and the surviving accounts, drawn from the testimony of the 23 who lived to tell their stories, and reconstructed from German records for those who did not survive to provide their own account, illustrate the wide range of ways the operation's individual escapees met their fate. Some were caught within hours, picked up at train stations close to the camp itself by alert German police conducting the kind of document checks that became standard practice the moment the scale of the escape became known. Others traveled for days, making considerable progress toward the borders they were aiming for, only to be caught by chance encounters, by papers that did not quite withstand close scrutiny, or by the simple cumulative bad luck of an operation being conducted across hostile territory by men who, however well prepared, were operating without the kind of support network that more established resistance or escape lines elsewhere in occupied Europe might have provided. The three who succeeded, the two Norwegian officers and the one Dutch officer, benefited from specific advantages that most of the other 73 escapees lacked. Their native language fluency in Norwegian and Dutch, respectively, gave them options for blending into the local population or making contact with resistance networks that the predominantly English-speaking majority of the escapees simply did not have available to them. Their specific routes, details of which have been documented in post-war accounts, took advantage of established contacts and escape lines that had been developed over years of occupation by resistance organizations in Norway and the Netherlands, organizations that had experience moving people clandestinely toward neutral Sweden, or in other cases, toward routes through France and Spain that had been used by downed airmen and escaped prisoners throughout the war. This raises an uncomfortable but historically important point. The selection process that had prioritized men with language skills and realistic prospects of success had, in this narrow sense, worked exactly as intended. The men most likely to succeed did, in fact, succeed, while the majority who lacked those specific advantages faced the much higher likelihood of capture that the organizers had recognized even as they made their initial allocation decisions. This does not diminish the tragedy of what happened to the 50 who were murdered, but it does illuminate the brutal calculus that the escape's planners had been forced to apply from the very beginning. Understanding that not every participant had an equal chance of genuine success, regardless of how the tunnel slots were allocated. The post-war investigation into the 50 murders deserves a fuller account of its own, because the process by which justice was eventually pursued reveals a great deal about how the Allied powers approached the broader challenge of accountability for German war crimes in the chaotic years immediately following the war's end. The investigation was assigned to the Royal Air Force's Special Investigation Branch, a relatively small specialized unit tasked with pursuing crimes specifically against RAF personnel, distinct from the broader and much larger apparatus that was simultaneously pursuing the major Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg and conducting the wider denazification process across occupied Germany. The lead investigator on the case, Wing Commander Wilfred Bose, approached the investigation with the specific methodical thoroughness of a detective rather than the broader historical or ideological framing that characterized some of the larger war crimes proceedings. His task was narrow and specific. Identify for each of the 50 murdered men exactly who had been responsible for the decision to kill him, who had carried out the killing, and where the physical evidence, bodies, burial sites, documentary trails, could be located and verified. This required years of painstaking work. Investigators traveled across occupied Germany and into territories that had become increasingly difficult to access as the post-war division of Europe hardened into the Cold War's Iron Curtain. Some of the relevant locations and witnesses ending up in the Soviet occupation zone, complicating investigative access in ways that added years to a process that was already inherently difficult. The investigators relied on multiple sources of evidence, captured German administrative records, where they survived the chaos of the war's final months and the deliberate destruction of incriminating documents by retreating German forces, provided some direct documentary evidence of orders given and received. German civilians who had witnessed elements of the killings, farmers who had seen vehicles stop along rural roads, witnesses to the sound of gunshots in locations where no combat had been occurring, individuals who had later discovered or been told about hastily concealed graves, provided crucial testimony once investigators were able to locate and interview them. Perhaps most importantly, surviving Gestapo and SS personnel who had been involved in the killings, once captured and facing their own legal jeopardy in the broader post-war reckoning, sometimes provided testimony against colleagues in exchange for more lenient treatment of their own cases. A grim but practically necessary feature of how post-war justice was pursued across many categories of Nazi crimes, relying on the willingness of perpetrators to implicate one another once the war was over and self-preservation became the primary motivation rather than loyalty to a regime that no longer existed. The investigation identified the perpetrators responsible for the great majority of the 50 killings, tracing the chain of command from Hitler's original order through Himmler and the broader SS and Gestapo apparatus down to the specific local officers who had carried out each individual murder. The geographic spread of the killings, 50 deaths across dozens of separate locations throughout Germany and occupied territory, meant that this required reconstructing not one chain of command but many overlapping ones, as different regional Gestapo offices had been tasked with executing prisoners captured within their respective jurisdictions. Trials were conducted before British military courts in occupied Germany beginning in the late 1940s and continuing into the early 1950s. The accused faced charges specifically related to the murder of prisoners of war in violation of the laws and customs of war, charges distinct from, though related to, the broader categories of crimes against humanity and war crimes being prosecuted in the larger Nuremberg proceedings and their successor trials. The outcomes varied. Some of the identified perpetrators were sentenced to death and executed. The British military authorities determining that the deliberate, premeditated nature of the killings, carried out under direct orders, with victims who were unarmed prisoners under guard, killed through deception about their actual fate, warranted the maximum available penalty. Others received substantial prison sentences, the severity often calibrated to the specific role each individual had played. Those who had given orders or organized the killings at a regional level generally faced harsher consequences than those who had been more junior personnel carrying out orders from superiors. Though the British courts did not entirely accept the just following orders defense that many defendants attempted to raise, recognizing that the fundamental illegality of executing unarmed prisoners should have been apparent to any officer, regardless of the chain of command pressure they were operating under. Not every perpetrator was brought to justice. Some had died in the war's final months, in combat, or through other causes, before any post-war investigation could reach them. Others successfully evaded identification, either through genuinely effective concealment of their wartime role, or simply through the practical limits of an investigation that, however thorough, could not locate and definitively prove the involvement of every single individual who had played some role in the broader killing operation. A small number are believed to have escaped to other countries. South America and the Middle East were common destinations for Nazi war criminals seeking to avoid post-war accountability beyond the practical reach of British or German legal authority. The investigation's conclusion, reached only after years of work, represented one of the more thorough single-incident war crimes investigations conducted by any Allied power in the post-war period, distinguished by its narrow focus on a specific, well-documented set of 50 killings rather than the broader and necessarily less granular approach that characterized prosecutions of crimes involving millions of victims. This narrower focus allowed for a kind of justice that the larger Nuremberg-style proceedings, dealing with the almost incomprehensible scale of the Holocaust and other mass atrocities, could not always achieve. The ability to name specifically each of the 50 murdered men, to trace the specific circumstances of each individual death, and to hold specific, identified individuals accountable for specific, documented acts rather than dealing only in the necessarily more abstract categories of systemic and organizational responsibility that dominated the larger war crimes proceedings. The story of what happened to Stalag Luft III itself after the war adds a final layer to the history. The camp was liberated by Soviet forces in early 1945 as the Red Army's advance swept through Silesia in the final months of the war. The prisoners who remained at the camp by that point, the broader population beyond the specific escapees of the March 1944 operation, which represented only a fraction of the thousands of Allied airmen held at Stalag Luft III over the course of its operation, were evacuated westward by the German guards in the war's final chaotic weeks, in what became known as the Long March, a brutal winter trek across hundreds of miles of collapsing German territory that constituted its own significant ordeal for the prisoners involved. Distinct from, but connected to the broader story of the camp's history. The territory in which the camp had stood became, with the post-war redrawing of European borders, part of Poland rather than Germany, and the town of Sagan became Jagan. The physical remains of the camp, the foundations of huts, the remnants of the tunnel systems, the general layout of what had been one of the most significant Allied prisoner of war facilities of the European war, were left largely undisturbed for decades, gradually being absorbed into the surrounding forest and landscape. known to local residents but not extensively developed as a historical site in the immediate post-war decades, when Poland's communist government had limited interest in commemorating what was, after all, primarily a story of Western Allied prisoners, rather than one that fit neatly into the narratives the post-war Polish state was generally interested in promoting. This changed substantially in the decades following the end of the Cold War, as historical interest in the site grew, supported by international cooperation between British, American, and Polish historical and veterans organizations interested in preserving and properly commemorating the location. Archaeological investigations conducted in subsequent years located and partially excavated sections of the tunnel systems, providing physical confirmation of details that had previously been known only through survivor testimony and documentary records. A museum was eventually established at the site, and the location has become a destination for historical tourism, drawing visitors interested in the specific history of the Great Escape, as well as broader visitors to the region interested in the history of prisoner of war camps and Allied air operations during the war. The museum's exhibits today include preserved sections of tunnel, recovered artifacts from the construction effort, fragments of the improvised tools, sections of the ventilation ductwork, examples of the forged documents that the camp's forgery department produced, and the memorial specifically dedicated to the 50 murdered officers, listing their names and the circumstances of their deaths in a manner intended to ensure that visitors understand not merely the dramatic story of the escape itself, but the genuine tragedy of what followed for the majority of those who took part. The broader historical legacy of the Great Escape extends beyond the specific site and the specific events of March 1944. The operation has become, in military and intelligence history, a frequently studied case of organizational planning under extreme constraint, examined by military academies and intelligence training programs, interested in the lessons it offers about resource improvisation, operational security, and the management of complex clandestine projects involving large numbers of participants who must be coordinated without the benefit of secure communications or any of the infrastructure that would normally support an operation of this scale and complexity. The story also occupies a particular place in the broader cultural memory of the Second World War, especially in Britain and the Commonwealth countries, whose officers made up the majority of those involved, as one of relatively few episodes from the prisoner of war experience that achieved widespread popular recognition, in significant part due to the 1963 film's enduring popularity, even as that popularity has, in certain respects, distorted public understanding of what actually happened by emphasizing the adventure and downplaying the atrocity that followed. Historians and educators working on the subject in subsequent decades have generally sought to correct this imbalance, emphasizing in their own accounts the full weight of what happened to the 50 murdered officers, alongside the genuine and remarkable story of the tunnel's construction, recognizing that both elements are essential to understanding the complete historical reality, rather than allowing the more cinematically appealing portion of the story to overshadow its darker and, in the end, more historically significant conclusion. What the Great Escape ultimately represents, when the full story is told rather than only its more palatable opening chapters, is a case study in the gap between the rules that governments formally agree to follow in wartime and what those same governments are actually willing to do when they believe the political or practical stakes justify abandoning those rules. Germany had signed the Geneva Convention. Germany's own military leadership, including senior Luftwaffe officers directly responsible for the camp, recognized that executing recaptured escapees violated that convention and said so explicitly to their superiors. And the order was given anyway, modified only at the margins to limit the number of killings, rather than reconsidered on the question of whether killing captured, unarmed prisoners of war was something that should be done at all. This is, in the end, the most important thing the story of the Great Escape has to teach. Beyond the genuine admiration that the engineering and organizational achievement of the tunnel's construction continues to deserve, that the protections international law extends to prisoners of war. However formally agreed, and however seriously most militaries on most occasions attempt to honor them, remain only as strong as the willingness of those holding power to actually abide by them when abiding by them becomes inconvenient. 50 men discovered in the most direct and personal way imaginable exactly how thin that protection could prove to be when a sufficiently angry head of state decided that an embarrassing security failure justified setting the rules aside. The tunnel they dug remains, in its way, a monument to what they accomplished despite everything stacked against them. The fate of 50 of the 76 who used it remains a monument to what was done to them in return. Both deserve to be remembered. Neither should be allowed to overshadow the other. The pines stand quiet now above the ground where the tunnels once ran. The camp is gone. The men are gone. The names remain, carved into a memorial in a country that did not exist in its current form when they died, for an escape that took place from a camp that no longer stands, in a war that ended 8 decades ago. The sand has long since settled back into the ground from which it came. A few final details about the individual lives involved in this story round out the picture, because the broad strategic and organizational narrative can obscure the fact that every person involved, diggers, forgers, guards, Gestapo officers, generals, the prisoners who survived and the 50 who did not, was an individual human being with their own specific history before these events swept them up. Roger Bushell, the operations chief architect, had been a promising barrister in London before the war, called to the bar and building a legal career before his interest in flying led him to join an auxiliary RAF squadron in the years before the conflict began. He was shot down and captured early in the war, and his subsequent history of repeated escape attempts before arriving at Stalag Luft III had already marked him in German records as a prisoner requiring particular vigilance, a reputation that makes his ultimate success in organizing an escape of this scale right under the nose of guards who had been specifically warned about him all the more remarkable. His death at the hands of Gestapo officers near the French border 5 days after the escape meant that he did not live to see either the eventual recognition of what he had built or the post-war investigation that would identify and prosecute those responsible for his murder. He was 33 years old. The 3 men who succeeded in reaching genuine freedom each had their own specific stories that illustrate how individual circumstances shaped outcomes within the larger collective effort. The Norwegian officers, both serving with RAF squadrons, composed substantially of Norwegian airmen who had escaped occupied Norway earlier in the war to continue fighting from Britain, were able to draw on their native fluency and on contacts within Norway's resistance movement to navigate their way toward neutral Sweden, a route that had been used successfully by various Norwegian resistance and escape networks throughout the occupation. The Dutch officers' path took advantage of similar resources within the Netherlands' own resistance infrastructure, though the specific details of his route differed from the Norwegians. given the different geography and occupation circumstances involved in reaching neutral territory from Dutch territory as opposed to Norwegian. All three men eventually made their way back to Britain and, in at least some cases, returned to active service before the war's end, carrying with them for the remainder of their lives the specific knowledge of having been among the fortunate few whose escape plan actually worked as intended, while so many of their fellow escapees, equally brave and equally committed to the operation, had not been so fortunate in the particular combination of language skills, geography, and simple chance that determined who succeeded and who did not. The story of Stalag Luft III's commandant during this period also deserves mention because his position illustrates the genuine moral complexity that existed even within the German military establishment responsible for administering the camp system. Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeiner, the Luftwaffe colonel who commanded the camp at the time of the escape, was himself placed in an extraordinarily difficult position by the events of March 1944. Von Lindeiner had run the camp with a degree of professional correctness that several surviving prisoners later acknowledged in their own post-war accounts, maintaining conditions that, while certainly representing the genuine hardship and restriction inherent to any prisoner of war camp, did not involve the kind of gratuitous cruelty that characterized many other German-run detention facilities, particularly those administered by the SS rather than the military. When the scale of the escape became known, von Lindeiner faced severe consequences of his own from German authorities furious at what was perceived as a catastrophic security failure under his command. He was removed from his position, arrested, and faced the prospect of court-martial proceedings, a process that was eventually overtaken by the broader collapse of the German war effort before it could reach a final resolution. He survived the war and lived into the post-war period, his own case becoming a minor footnote in the broader history of how the German military establishment dealt with officers whose commands had experienced significant security failures, distinct from but related to the much more serious question of how the SS and Gestapo officers who had carried out the murders themselves would eventually be held accountable. The distinction between von Lindeiner's situation and that of the Gestapo officers who carried out the killings illustrates an important and historically significant division within the German wartime state. The Luftwaffe officers who ran the camp, however much they were ultimately serving a criminal regime, and however much their own service contributed to that regime's broader war effort, operated within a professional military culture that retained, even in 1944, some genuine attachment to the traditional laws and customs of war governing the treatment of prisoners. The Gestapo and SS apparatus that carried out the murders operated under a fundamentally different set of values, one in which the regime's political and ideological priorities consistently overrode whatever residual attachment to international law or traditional military honor might otherwise have existed. This division was not absolute. Plenty of regular German military personnel participated in or facilitated genuine war crimes throughout the conflict, and plenty of SS and Gestapo personnel were simply following orders without any particular ideological enthusiasm of their own. But the specific case of the Great Escape and its aftermath illustrates the distinction with unusual clarity, precisely because the Luftwaffe officers responsible for the camp objected on the record to orders that came from outside their own chain of command and that violated standards they themselves still recognized as binding. even as those objections proved insufficient to prevent the killings from being carried out by a different and more ideologically committed branch of the German state apparatus. The story, told in full, resists easy simplification into either pure heroism or pure tragedy. It contains genuine heroism, the extraordinary collective achievement of building 3 tunnels under conditions that should have made the task impossible, sustained by months of careful, disciplined, collaborative labor by hundreds of men who refused to accept that the captivity was permanent or that resistance was futile. It contains genuine tragedy, the deliberate murder of 50 of those men, killed not in the chaos of war, but through the calculated, considered decision of a state that had formally agreed to treat prisoners of war according to specific rules and chose, when those rules became inconvenient, to violate them with calculated precision. And it contains, in the post-war investigation and prosecution of those responsible, something that approaches a kind of justice, imperfect, incomplete, achieved only after years of painstaking work, but real and significant precisely because it insisted on treating each of the 50 murdered men as an individual victim deserving of a specific, documented accounting of what had happened to him, rather than allowing their deaths to be absorbed anonymously into the vast and necessarily less granular reckoning that the post-war world applied to the larger catalogue of Nazi crimes. The tunnel called Harry, the survivor of the 3, carried 76 men into the cold March night of 1944. 23 of them lived to see the war's end. 3 of them achieved the full freedom that escape was meant to deliver. 50 of them were murdered in the weeks that followed, each death individually ordered, individually carried out, individually investigated after the war, and individually commemorated today on a memorial standing on ground that was once German territory and is now Polish soil, in a country that exists, in its current borders, only because of the war that the men who dug that tunnel had been fighting in the first place. The pines stand quiet now, sleep now. The end